Hello and welcome to History Bubble Extra on early colonial Tasmania, a place much less strictly regulated than the mainland, leading to huge amounts of crime, bushranging, and overall anarchy. And how this come to be will be further explored in this episode. The colonization of Tasmania, or as it was known back then, Van Diemen's Land, was planned from the beginning of the penal colony. But when some French ships were spotted on the Australian coast, they started to fear that if they did not start colonization fast, the French or other colonial powers might take parts of the continent for themselves. So the British were in quite a hurry to spread the settlements. Two first of these were to be created to give them the Tasmanian Strait, a strategic position securing a somewhat faster route to Sydney. The two settlements to be created were located in the modern-day cities of Hobart and Melbourne. To Hobart in Tasmania, 49 settlers were sent, and they went to work to prepare the location for future settlement on a larger scale. Meanwhile, they had been sent over 300 to Melbourne, but it turned out this location had meager ground, and thus it was so hard to colonize, so after a time, they joined the settlements in Van Diemen's Land. But Tasmania was not that much better than Melbourne, and with bad soil, shifting streams and poor yield, Hobart, as most places in early Australia's history, was a huge disappointment. This meager yield in Hobart resulted in the colony soon starting to face the threat of a food shortage, as the pre-gathered supplies started to run out and rations were cut and starvation started to kick in. The mainland was not much help either, since they had to deal with their own food shortage, as a flood had struck them. The situation slowly started to improve, partly because of better agricultural yield, but that part of the food supply was still lacked. True saving grace of early Tasmania also later turned out to be their biggest problem, this being the kangaroo and hunting, which became the largest food supply. Tasmania was built on the foundation of the gun. The most profitable profession in early Tasmania was kangaroo hunting, which made the convicts practicing it familiar to both the bush and a gun, often even more so than the guards and soldiers who were supposed to keep the peace. These convicts were also supposed to sell their game to the government, but as time went on, less and less did, instead turning to the black market and selling directly to other convicts. As the bush became the home of many convicts, they started encountering and getting into conflict with local aboriginals, killing them and infecting them with old world diseases. And within a few decades, almost all of the 4,000 aborigines of Tasmania were gone, and after which there were so few left, if any, that some had gone so far to call this a genocide. But farming soon became sustainable, and the demand for kangaroo meat dropped, and even though the skin was still needed, it was not enough to sustain oneself. So they needed to find a new profession, and with their immense bush knowledge and skill with a gun, most turned to a life of crime and sheep stealing. This all proved quite easy, as if not caught in the act, which was very rare, the bushrangers had a very hard time getting caught, as most had learned to survive for months in the wild. The soldiers were few and scarce, and they were very unfamiliar with the bush, and even if they did capture a bushranger, they had a hard time convicting him, since they needed a witness, and most convicts would not like to leave their farm unattended for a few months, as a trial needed to be in Sydney. And besides, most convicts supported the bushrangers more than the government, since the bushrangers had mostly undeservedly built up a kind of Robin Hood-like reputation, as they stole from big farmers and sold to the small ones. Although in almost all cases, this was because it was much easier that way, rather than for some moral reasons. Soon, an amnesty was offered to all bushrangers who turned themselves in, but this amnesty was so poorly put together, it allowed the bushrangers to commit any crime other than murder before the amnesty's end, which resulted in countless crimes. When the amnesty came into place, few turned themselves in. After this complete failure, the colony imposed martial law, all tickets of leave were revoked, the sale of kangaroo skin became forbidden, and all kangaroo dogs were shot, in the hopes of destroying the bushrangers' supply. This also made them able to hang anyone they please, so they hung any bushranger they caught, rather than having them to go to trial. But gangs were still forming. The biggest consisted of over 25 men attacking settlements, especially floggers, people with a reputation for treating convicts badly. This gang, led by a man named Michael Howie, pillaged all through Tasmania and got the favor of convicts and small farmers, which gave them many informers and a few new recruits. The gang was very organized and well informed on troop movement, and thus were very hard to catch. Howie, and arguably most of his gang members, justified the pillaging and raiding by coming to a sense of being a revenge for the convicts to the unjust authorities, as they only attacked bigger farmers and government workers. The looting could continue almost undisturbed as the army was unable to deal with such a large band of looters and often lost skirmishes had with the bandits. They neither spared the Aborigines and took inspiration from their culture in the form of stealing wives, and many of the bushrangers has taken a wife for themselves in Aboriginal raids, as they often came in useful for their skills in bush survival. Even Howie participated and stole a woman he named Black Mary. One day, Howie and his Aboriginal wife were ambushed by Tasmanian soldiers, and Howie ran while his wife, heavy in pregnancy, could not. Bullets were in stains, and in the frenzy, Howie accidentally shot his wife. Mary now wanted revenge on her husband. After recovering from her wounds and giving birth, she helped the soldiers search for Michael, but they could not find him. Howie was promised a pardon for all his crimes, except murder if he turned himself in, and a chance for pardon for even murder if he would turn others in, which he started to do, naming settlers who bought stolen goods. But Howie fled again before the pardon was enacted, and his gang had fallen apart without him. He managed to make small robberies and evade capture for a while, but soon were faced with a shootout with two bounty hunters, and Howie was killed. The main thing Howie proved was that a lot of the convicts, and maybe settlers, were on the side of the bushrangers, and when another convict gang, led by Matthew Brady, started raiding the bush, most convicts were on their side. The lieutenant governor of Van Diemen's Land called every man to join a hunt for the gang, but it seemed most convicts were more interested in feeding and hiding the Brady gang than killing them, so the government needed some other way of catching them. So tried to offer a bounty of £25 for each member killed, and if a convict gave information leading to arrest of Brady, he would get his ticket of leave, and if they captured him themselves, an unconditional pardon was bestowed upon them, and they were sent back to England. But this gave no results. Brady, as most bushrangers, saw himself as the good guy and a good man, and in a raid no woman would be harmed, and once when his gang member threatened rape, he was shot in the hand, flogged and kicked out of the gang. He neither hurt any convicts in his raid if they did not harm him, so he built up his own sense of justice, and were a force to be reckoned with to the police, often coming out victorious in engagement, and they treated the prisoners differently depending on how they treated convicts and bushrangers before. But the gang was gradually being weared down, and Brady was shot in the leg in a shootout, and captured a few days later and hanged, much to the dismay of the general populace, who wanted him pardoned, and even today he has places named after him. He was the last great bushrangers who could really threaten the progress of Tasmania, as the settlements had grown so large it could handle bushrangers, ending this period of Tasmanian history and this episode.